Let's discuss the top 5 reasons against a vegan diet. If we are what we eat, what are you made of? Are you in a constant battle with your food? Try to take a step in the right direction as we discuss the top 5 reasons against a vegan diet. Okay, the first excuse is that it's biological. The vegan answer is our canines. As you can see, carnivores have sharp teeth, such as omnivores, these are human canines, and herbivores, whereas humans resemble herbivores much more. Number 2 is our stomachs. As you can see here, we have a human stomach and a rabbit stomach. The length of the stomach tract is much more of a herbivore and an omnivore than a carnivore, which has a different length of a intestinal tract wall. Now, the prevention of cancer here in your digestive system is relevant to your animal proteins that you're eating. Excessive animal proteins can develop into intestinal worms. Also, WHO, the World Health Organization, classifies any processed red meats as cancerous. The scientific body from around the world has deemed processed meats causing colorectal cancer in association with stomach cancer. Now, let's take a scientific look at exactly what is going on when we eat these meats, especially red meats, eggs. As you can see here, plant proteins and animal proteins differ in terms of good bacteria that you're putting in your body, short-chain fatty acids, and as well as something called TMAO. Now, what is TMAO? Contributing to inflammatory bowel disease and cardiovascular disease, TMAO or trimethyl amino oxide is a chemical that is made through the consumption of foods that we eat, eggs, red meat, seafood, salmon. And basically this TMAO stuff makes your stickiness of your arteries, making all of the fats that are inside of your body and circulating through your vascular system more sticky, developing into plaques, arteries, atherosclerosis, strokes, heart attacks, and other fatalities regarding your cardiovascular system. Let's look at this scientific study from Cornell University examining the metabolic fate of TMAO in humans. TMAO is associated with chronic disease risk. The study examined 40-year-old men and gave them 50 milligrams to quantitatively assess the metabolic fate of orally consumed TMAO in humans. Quantitative measurement samples included blood, urine, stool, and skeletal muscles from these young men. The TMAO was detected as early as 15 minutes, peaked at 1 hour, and remained elevated through the 6-hour period. TMAO is derived from consumption of choline, which is abundant in eggs, and L-carnitine, which is abundant in red meat. Dietary choline and L-carnitine are metabolized by your gut to TMA and a small amount of DMA and methylamine. Now, these amines are absorbed via the enterohepatic circulation and oxidized into TMAO, circulating into your system and excreted through your urine. Highly abundant in fish and seafood, which is ironically the opposite, which touted for its cardioprotective benefits. TMAO is known to have adverse cardiac events such as stroke, heart attack, and heart failure. Now, when we consider these processed meats here, really is not worth the risk. But what is the one key of the puzzle that's missing? What is the one thing that animal foods do not have that plants are in abundance of? It's called the big F for fiber. Fiber content of foods. We have plant sources on the right here, which are abundant. Blueberries are a great source, cucumbers, cooked carrots. Animal sources, however, have none. How does this affect the body? Here is a research that has been published about the microbes inside of your digestive gut. that naturally rely on food with plant sources as their food. Now, what happens is natural layer of mucus lines the gut. It erodes if you do not have any fiber to a dangerous point where this bad bacteria can infect your colon wall. What happens is these bad bacteria will multiply if you are feeding it animal proteins and not multiply if you are feeding it fiber foods. It might sound like a scene from a science fiction movie, helpful bacteria eating your host from within, but that's what happens when they don't get what they want. There is an intricate balance of good bacteria that is inside of your gut microbiota. Now, the rat study took dietary fiber deprivation, which leads to bad bacteria pathogens. The left is a fiber-rich diet, the right is a fiber-free diet. There is an imbalance of bad bacteria to good bacteria. What happens is the mucus layer deteriorates and the bad pathogens end up entering your system. When the scientists looked at the samples of their gut tissue, they saw not only a thinner and patchy mucus layer, they also saw inflammation across a wide area, whereas fiber-rich mice before the study had a small bit of inflammation. What that says, explains Desai, the leader of the group of the study, to make it simple, these holes are created by our microbiota while eroding the mucus serves a wide open door for these pathogenic microorganisms to invade. This study shows that there is a direct link between our controllable eating patterns versus cancer. This table shows intestinal cancer versus animal sources studied in a multiple country analysis. The animal eating countries, particularly colder dairy eating countries such as Canada, Finland, France, Denmark, all hit up the top of the list, whereas your more carbohydrate, plant source rich countries are at the bottom of the list, such as Venezuela, Mexico, and Colombia. Let's see what Dr. McGreger has to say about cancer and food consumption.
Colorectal cancer is the third most common cause of cancer death in the world. Thankfully, the good bacteria in our gut take the fiber we eat and make short-chain fatty acids like butyrate that protect us from cancer. We take care of them, they take care of us. If you do nothing to colon cancer cells, they grow. That's what cancer does. But if you expose colon cancer cells to the concentration of butyrate our good bacteria make in our gut when we eat fiber, the growth is stopped in its tracks. But if the butyrate stops, if we just eat healthy for one day and then turn off the fiber, the cancer can resume its growth. So ideally, we have to eat lots of fiber-rich foods, meaning whole plant foods, every single day.
Reason number 2 against a vegan diet, the vitamin dose. Doesn't vegan diets lead to vitamin deficiencies? I mean, don't we eat enough vitamins through our diet? And don't we need animals to provide those vitamins and micronutrients? Let's look at the scientific facts. And as we shall see in a few short moments, there is an optimal diet, including all the vitamins and micronutrients that you need through a plant-based vegan eating your way through this pyramid. At the top, we find our fats and essential micronutrients. Bottom, we see our proteins and alternatives. Next, we have vegetables and fruits. You should eat in a large amount. And the bottom includes grains and carbohydrates, the most we should eat in our day. Now, take these Americans. They look like a normal family, but in fact, they're not. It is the Campbells, Dr. Colin T. Campbell and Kim Campbell, his son, who have made the documentary Plant Pure Nation. The documentary explores the lives of countless Americans who are in a chronic health condition and entrapped by the American food industry, with no reality of the cost of a poor diet that lacks plant foods. The popularity of this documentary spun a Plant Pure Nation cookbook, which you can buy online through their websites. Let's hear what they have to say.
Well, there's a lot of difference of opinion about it, and there's a faction of people who insist that there are different diets for different people. But I think that the evidence is fairly clear that that's not true, and there really is an appropriate diet for humans, just like there's a best diet for cats, dogs, elephants, and any other mammal. And the best diet for humans is one that is plant-based, almost all calories coming from 4 principal food groups: fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. It's low in fat, high in fiber, not very much processed food. None is great, but in today's world, I don't know how realistic that is.
What we have seen in nutrition for many, many years, I must say, is a lot of confusion. You go and survey people, outside of the science and ask them what do they think about nutrition is, and you can hear all kinds of comments. I eat this, I eat that, and this is good, and this is not good. There's also confusion in the professions. Medical doctors are not trained in this field. And there's confusion in my own field, biomedical research. We don't get an opportunity to tell, the real science, I think, the way it should be told, because we're overwhelmed with the corporate sector trying to sell stuff.
We are living in extreme times where we have 27% of people dying of heart disease, 25% of cancer, 10% of stroke, 4 or 5% from diabetes, the same number for Alzheimer's. I mean, these are, in many, many cases, diseases of nutritional ignorance and diseases that are all based on our lifestyle choices.
There are a lot of different dietary theories out there, but I think one fact is kind of indisputable. Having a diet that is rich in whole plant-based foods is truly a great way to get you to good health.
Everywhere I go around the world, there's not a single person I've met that doesn't know that fruits and vegetables are good for them. We all know it. It's not about the knowing, it's about the doing.
There was a time when there was no heart disease, no colon cancer, no breast cancer, no multiple sclerosis, no inflammatory arthritis. Of course, these days in Asia, the Middle East, in Central America, and around the world, people have become rich. They have given up much of their starch and they replaced it with meat and dairy. Throughout history, rich people, the royalty, the pharaohs, the queens, the kings, the priests, the priestesses, the people could afford to eat the meat. They had artery disease, they had obesity, they were sick. Nothing's changed except for the number of kings and queens living in the world.
Kings and queens, indeed. The number 2 reason, vitamin dose, people say, is protein. Where do I get my protein from? Well, let's first discuss what exactly is a protein. A protein is a set of particular amino acids that are formed in a sequence. Now, this table here represents the percentage of Americans with inadequate micronutrients. Protein is at the very bottom of the list. So most people meet their protein requirements, if not all of people in modern society. Researcher Kenneth Carpenter published in the Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 1992 the nutritional requirements of proteins from modern humans from an evolutionary perspective. He discovered that researchers found 6% of protein from your diet makes up all of your protein requirements for modern humans, whereas carnivorous cats and other animals require about 20%. Why is there such a popularity for protein in our modern society? Because as an evolutionary standpoint, this picture looks quite different. Normal food from single-stomached higher animals has either been plants, fungi, and carcasses of wild animals. The practice of hunting wild animals as prey or domesticating, such as fattening or finishing them up with heavy grains, has been a modern development, as well as processing sugars, starches, oils through the extraction from plant foods has been a modern development. Before then, we stuck to eating the entire plant, if not its parts, leaves, seeds, fruits, and tubers. How did we reach a point of eating the protein machinery of animals and plants, as well as their energy storages, without a demand for reproduction or growth? Let's check out what Dr. Greger has to say.
There's been a history of enthusiasm for protein in the nutrition world. A century ago, the protein requirements were more than twice what we know them to be today. This enthusiasm peaked in the 1950s, and with the United Nations identifying protein deficiency as a serious, widespread global problem. There was a protein gap that needed to be filled. This was certainly convenient for the U.S. dairy industry, who could dump their post-war surplus of dried milk onto the Third World, rather than having to just bury it. But this led to the great protein fiasco. There was a disease of malnutrition called kwashiorkor that was assumed to be caused by protein deficiency, famously discovered by Dr. Cicely Williams, who spent the latter half of her life debunking the very condition that she first described. Turns out there's no real evidence of dietary protein deficiency. The actual cause of kwashiorkor remains obscure, but fecal transplant studies suggest changes in gut flora may be a causal factor. How could the field of nutrition have gotten it so spectacularly wrong? A famous editorial about the profession started with these words: "The dispassionate objectivity of scientists is a myth. No scientist is simply involved in the single-minded pursuit of truth. He or she is also engaged in the passionate pursuit of research, grants, and professional success. Nutritionists may wish to attack malnutrition, but they also wish to earn their living in ways they find congenial. This inevitably encourages researchers to make a case for the importance of their own portion of the field and their nutrient, which was protein." Science eventually prevailed, though, and there was a massive recalculation of human protein requirements in the 1970s, which at the stroke of a pen closed the so-called protein gap and destroyed the theory of this pandemic of protein malnutrition. Infant protein requirements went from a recommended 13% of daily calories down to 10%, then 7%, and then down to 5%. However, to this day, there are still those obsessing about protein. Those promoting Paleolithic diets, for example, try to make the case for protein from an evolutionary perspective.
Okay, but what does the science say about our daily recommended protein allowance, and are there risks of eating too much animal proteins?
She's fine-tuned over millions of years. Adults require no more than 0.8 or 0.9 grams of protein per healthy kilogram of body weight per day. So that's like your ideal weight in pounds multiplied by 4 and then divided by 10. So someone whose ideal weight is 100 pounds may require up to 40 grams of protein a day. On average, they probably only need about 30 grams a day, which is 0.66 grams per kilogram, but we say 0.8 or 0.9 because everyone's different and we want to capture most of the bell curve. People are more likely to suffer from protein excess than protein deficiency. The adverse effects associated with long-term high-protein diets may include disorders of bone and calcium balance, disorders of kidney function, increased cancer risk, disorders of the liver, and worsening of coronary artery disease. Therefore, there's currently no reasonable scientific basis to recommend protein consumption above the current recommended daily allowance due to its potential disease risks.
And you can check out Dr. McGreger's website, nutritionfacts.org, his YouTube sources for informational videos, and his book on how not to die. All right, we are closing the discussion on protein and moving on to another micronutrient deficiency, iron. Iron is a micronutrient that is available in the flesh of animals commonly. It's also available in plants, stored in the hemoglobin molecule in the human blood and red blood cells which transport oxygen. This is concern for our diet because most women may be deficient in iron. As you can see, the upper tolerable limit, there is a peak of absorbed iron per day. The plant foods that have iron include beans, legumes, soybean products such as tofu and tempeh, nuts and seeds, and dark leafy greens. Beware, as dairy and animal proteins may block the absorption of iron. But isn't dairy products at least good for calcium?
Hey guys, shouldn't be giving me a hard time. I mean, I may not be so big now.
But I'm drinking milk, because in these years I'm growing faster than I ever will again. And I need milk's calcium for bones.
And protein for muscle, more now than I ever did as a kid. In fact,
this is how I'm gonna look when I'm 19. I don't forget a name or a face. I'll probably have forgiven you guys by then.
But you never can tell.
Milk, it does a body good.
Only human milk is made for humans to consume. Dairy milk is never made for humans to consume. In fact, calcium from dairy is the opposite of building strong bones. Here's a study showing the occurrence of breast cancer with the inclusion of dairy products, including milk, in your diet. Again, calcium for strong bones is not made by these deadly dairy products. And the scientists think so too. Dr. Colin T. Campbell is the author of the China study claiming that cow's milk protein may be the single most significant chemical carcinogen to which humans are exposed. Dr. McDougall is a plant-based doctor with years researching the dairy industry and about the death and dangers of dairy products.
The basic problem is that cow's milk was designed over, I don't know how long cows have been around. Well, let's just guess, 20 million years cows have been around. For 20 million years, or their predecessors, however long they were around, this evolution has gone on to develop this ideal food for baby cows called cow's milk. And they do a good job. They grow baby cows very well, and eventually a baby cow weighs, as an adult, 1,000 to 1,500 pounds and stands about 4.5 feet tall. And there are lots and lots and lots of cows in this country, like about 96 million cows. So it's working out really well, this cow's milk is for cows. But cow's milk is not the right food for people. Milk is specifically designed for a species of animal. And one of the qualities of the milk is that it has to fit the needs related to growth. So let's take a look at some figures here concerning growth of an animal compared to the protein content, which is vital to growth. You've got to have protein involved in the growth process. Let's take a look at the protein content based upon rate of growth. And rate of growth here is the amount of time that is required to double the size of the animal. So human breast milk has 1.2 grams per 100 milliliters, and the growth rate or doubling time is 6 months. Horses, 2.4, doubles in size in 60 days. Cows, 3.3, doubles in size in 47 days. Dog, 7.1, doubles in size in 8 days. And a rat, 11.8 grams per 100 cc's, and it doubles in size in 4.5 days. You see the connection there? This is a food that has a protein content ideal for an animal that doubles in size about 4 times as fast as we do. There are other nutritional qualities that fit ideally for a cow, but differ greatly from us. And that is the calcium content, for example. The calcium content of cow's milk is 4 times higher than the calcium content of human breast milk. Fits ideally for growing a cow, but it was absolutely unnecessary to have that kind of calcium load to grow a person. If it was necessary, then human breast milk would contain that amount of calcium. And so it is with the other nutrients. Cow's milk is supercharged because of the fact that you need to grow this animal very rapidly to a very large size. Makes sense. Milk is sold to people in this country as the ideal food to build strong bones. Now, I need to point out to you that originally milk was sold to you based upon the calcium content. And everybody in this room knows that the reason milk builds strong bones is because it's filled with calcium. And of course, bones have a lot of calcium in them, so it makes sense, right? Well, there was a problem that's developed, and that is that scientists started to think about this a little bit and look at the research a little more carefully. And even consumers have looked at this, and they've come to the conclusion that this really doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, the picture that you'd have to have in mind, believing that calcium is so important for bone growth, is you'd have to have this kind of thought process going on. You'd have to think, what I do to grow strong bones is I shove a lot of calcium in past my lips, through my esophagus, into my intestine, and if I shove it fast enough and hard enough, so I'll develop a high concentration in the intestine, which will push through the intestinal wall into the bloodstream and build up a high concentration of calcium in the bloodstream, and then it will get pushed into the bones and stuffed into the bones. That's what you have to believe. You have to believe the gut is a passive sieve. You know what a sieve is? Something you drain your spaghetti with, a sieve. It has no judgment, no control, just a sieve, and that's what the gut wall would be. By shoving this calcium in, it just goes right in through the bones, into the bones. Of course, that's nonsense. Not only would that never happen in nature, but it would be deadly if it did, because if you consumed the gallons of milk and the handfuls of calcium pills that are recommended, you would die. You would die from soft tissue calcification. Your kidneys would be calcified, your muscles would get calcified, your heart would get calcified, and you would die. So what we have instead of this passive sieve is we have a very intelligent gut wall. it is so intelligent that when you do silly things like take these large, extraordinary amounts of calcium, it will block the calcium out and save your life. If you do something at the other extreme, which is to take a lower amount of calcium, say you just eat plant foods, rice, corn, oranges, potatoes, and so on, well, it will do that gut walls. It will go out and reach out into that food supply, and it will grab that calcium and pull that calcium in very efficiently into the blood, and it will always meet your calcium needs. Now, how do I know it always meets calcium needs? Because I have searched. The World Health Organization has searched. The United States government has searched for a single case of calcium deficiency caused by a low calcium diet. And we have all come up empty-handed. There has never been a case of dietary calcium deficiency ever reported in the world literature. There is no such disease. And yet, billions of people live on diets that contain no dairy products, no Tums, no calcium pills, and they grow normal adult skeletons. How could they do that? You wouldn't believe that would be possible if you listened to the dairy industry, the calcium pill industry, would you? But your own observations say that what they're teaching you cannot be true. So if you find a case of dietary calcium deficiency, in other words, not enough calcium in a diet causes the disease, I'm the first one that knows, please, so I get to report it in the medical journal and become world famous. Okay, so the calcium bit didn't work, right? So the dairy industry now has to figure out another way to tell you how dairy products build strong bones. And those of you who are a little more sophisticated in this and have been reading the newspapers and some of the news articles, or more importantly the medical journals, you will see that now the dairy industry, as well as the pork and the beef industry, have figured out how their products build strong bones. What they are telling you is the reason that these foods that are high in protein build strong bones is a direct effect of the protein on the bones. The protein causes the bones to grow stronger. And they have put millions of dollars into that research to show you that. And millions more into the media to get the publicity spin so that the public will know about it. Let me talk to you about these two issues for a few minutes. The dairy industry now has a new campaign. It's called 3 a day. 3 a day for stronger bones. 3 dairy products a day for stronger bones. Do you know where they get that slogan from? You've heard of the 5 a day program, which is a really good, legitimate program. It's now gone up to 9 a day because they know 5 a day of fruits and vegetables really isn't enough, but that's where they started. Now they're up to telling you to eat 9 a day. Pretty soon they'll be telling you something really radical like just eat fruits and vegetables, because that's what the truth is. Okay, so they have this 3 a day campaign. Look at what they're advertising. This is one of their slogans. They're not just advertising skim milk, are they? They've got cheese and milk and yogurt and ice cream and whatever. They're just anything. If you look at the ads to tell you to build strong bones, they're telling you to consume not just low-fat products, but any of their products. Any advertisements you see for osteoporosis. And you might stop and think for a minute. You might say, now listen, I see a little problem here. I hear the Heart Association and other organizations telling me that I should avoid these high-fat, high-cholesterol foods because they'll give me strokes, heart attacks, adult-type diabetes, obesity, colon cancer, breast cancer. What a dirty, rotten trick. To get a necessary nutrient, calcium, I have to risk my life. And you start thinking, maybe there's something wrong here. Maybe my Creator didn't make a horrible mistake. You see the problem here? If you believe that the human being was designed correctly in an environment that is supposed to support the human being, then how could you have such a contradiction exist? How could you have a recommendation that will give you breast cancer and heart disease, yet is necessary to grow strong bones? It makes no sense. Was our Creator out to lunch? Maybe at McDonald's. Maybe he had that cerebral disease that S was talking about. Okay, so that's the new plan, 5 a day. First thing I want to point out to you is that calcium is a mineral. It comes from the ground. Always remember that it comes from the ground. Calcium does not come from milk originally, does not come from plants originally. Where it comes from is from the ground. All your minerals, copper, manganese, iron, potassium, sodium, all these minerals that you're so busy talking about and many of you are taking supplements for, all of these minerals come from the ground. The way they get into all animals is they dissolve in watery solutions. The roots of plants take these minerals up from these watery solutions, incorporate the minerals in the roots, leaves, flowers, stems, and fruits, leaves, flowers, stems. Anyway, all the parts of the plants, and it's got to be another part. And what we do as animals, or other animals do, is they go and eat the parts of the plants, right? No animal eats ground, except for a 2-year-old. So what we want to do is we want to get the minerals from the more original source. We're not going to eat ground, so what's the next choice? Plants. Plants are so sufficient in minerals that mineral deficiency is almost non-existent in the world, with 2 exceptions. And those are iodine deficiency, and in very rare cases, selenium deficiency, and maybe a third, maybe very, very, very rare cases, zinc deficiency, but nothing you ever have to worry about. These are very isolated situations. If you want to read more about the mineral and the vitamin issue, in last month's newsletter on my website, I wrote about vitamins and minerals and why I don't recommend them. Okay, so that's where the original source of calcium is from. We should go to that original source, and as I mentioned, you always get enough if you go to that original source. Let's take a look at some of the recommendations that have been given in the scientific literature for our calcium intake, just to help you focus on the problem here. If you look at the research that was done, the basic research, if you look at science and you study it as I have, and I've studied the science well over 100 years of scientific research, what you find is the really basic stuff was done back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. We build upon that, but the basic research was done back then. The basic research shows that a person, whether that person is nursing or pregnant, requires 150 to 200 milligrams of calcium a day. That's it. The average calcium intake in underdeveloped countries is 300 to 500 milligrams a day. Try and remember some of these figures. Calcium intake for the average American is 500 to 600 milligrams a day. World Health Organization. World Health Organization, that's responsible for the nutritional needs of most people on this earth, recommend 400 to 500 milligrams a day. But industry-influenced organizations in this country recommend amounts such as 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams a day from the U.S. Food and Nutrition Board, and the National Institutes of Health, 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams a day. Ask yourself, you see these figures, you ask yourself, how in the world could we have recommendations all the way from 150 to 1,500 milligrams a day? How could such numbers exist? The only way such numbers could exist is if calcium intake has little or nothing to do with the health of the bones. And that's what the truth is, and I'll show you how that works in just a second. The dairy industry has influenced, no, excuse me, let me say it correctly. The dairy industry has paid for almost all of the research studying the effects of calcium on bone health.
Thanks to Dr. McDougall, we now understand from a scientific perspective about calcium and dairy products. Where can we get calcium in plant foods? Here are the types of foods that are nutrient-rich in calcium. Top of the list is sesame seeds. My personal favorite is tahini, which is a sesame paste. Soybeans and tofu products are the next one on our list, containing over 300 milligrams. Next one is almonds. Other nuts contain a high amount of calcium, as well as winged beans, green beans, French beans, long beans, dark leafy greens such as kale and collard greens, broccoli, and oranges. Especially useful when juiced. Let's take a look at some of the tactics that our modern media uses for us to eat dairy products.
If you want to grow up big and strong, then buy my Mammal Udder Juice products. They won't actually make you big and strong, but we've been literally saying they'll make your bones stronger for years, and no one's questioned it. Yes, in its runny liquid form, this liquid cow teat spray pairs perfectly with everything from your high fructose flakes of corn to your sugary discs of fat, or just by itself. Mmm. So fresh you can still taste the animal milk sack that we squeezed this out of. Yes, this nutrient-rich ooze was meant for another mammal, but we'll tell you it's good for you by showing you that one athlete you like so much and put a glue that looks like milk on her upper lip. Right, athlete?
Do you have this product?
Oh, ho, ho, what a slogan! And all those sugary treats wouldn't taste good without my solidified udder fat. That's right. Most baked items, fried items, or generally cooked items use slabs of the fattiest part of the cow goo. Or sometimes you spread it on top of the baked things once they're done. Either way, we make sure that you're always eating it. Or you can have our aged cow titty goop. Depending on how long we let it get moldy changes what kind of fancy block of solid pus it becomes. And if we can't sell enough of it, we'll sneak the excess into your food without you knowing it. In fact, we made it possible for us to sneak it into a ton of food with some fancy politics. How do you think pizza companies made their crust taste better? It's all thanks to us. That's right. Even if you don't think you're buying my goo, you're buying my goo. But you're probably willingly buying my animal squishy glom because we crammed our udder goo agenda into your food pyramid or plate or whatever nonsense picture you subscribe to tell you how to eat healthy. So you now think that you need this in your diet. Once we've brainwashed you to add my gloopy animal squirts into your diet, we've got you for good. Because these solidified cow nipple drops are physically addictive. That's right. When we mold our cow breast milk into these solid blocks of melty mush, it creates casomorphins, which is an opiate more addictive than morphine, which is good for us, because if you really knew how we treat the cows whose udder drops we steal, you wouldn't buy it. It's horrifying and unhygienic and full of hormones and drugs and literal pus and animal abuse. Or maybe you do know all this, but you're too addicted to my solidified blocks of fresh-squeezed mammal to care. If it makes you feel better to pretend that the milk tastes better when the cows are happier, we'll show you a bunch of cows in the field. But that's unrelated to our actual process. So drink and eat my creamy goo that shot out of a larger animal's stomach. 'Cause look, it melts, which is somehow an appealing thing for eating. That's right, numb it up. I'm Roger, by the way, but you can call me the milkman.
Now that we've finished our discussion on calcium, let's take another look at the biggest vitamin we have to find, vitamin B12. There is many confusion surrounding this molecule of B12. Am I obtaining enough? What are the right sources to obtain it? Let's check out what Dr. McGreger has to say.
Though it may be easier and cheaper to just take something once a week, some people would rather get into the habit of doing something daily so they don't forget. So how much would you have to take if you wanted to take vitamin B12 once a day rather than once a week? Using the formula we just learned, 1.5 plus 0.01 times the quantity of x minus 1.5 equals 4 to 7 solve for x. All weight, once a day, 250 micrograms or more is all we need. You can put it next to your toothbrush to remind yourself, whatever it takes. The reason we can't absorb more than about 1.5 at a time directly through our receptors is that they get filled up. But it only takes them about 4 to 6 hours to unload their cargo into the body and are back in business. So if we got B12 3 times a day, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we could absorb 1.5 each time and end up with 4.5 at the end of the day, which is all we need. And these kind of doses we can get from fortified foods. The so-called daily value on nutrition facts labels for B12 is 6 micrograms. So as long as each serving provides 25% of our daily value, then we can eat a serving of B12 fortified foods at every meal, and we wouldn't have to take supplements at all. So, for example, there's vitamin B12 fortified nutritional yeast. A half teaspoon counts as a serving, so you could sprinkle that on your meals, but that'd be like $1 a week, as opposed to just a few pennies a week for B12 supplements. But whichever path you choose, and there's lots of various fortified B12 fortified foods out there, these are not just recommendations for people eating plant-based diets. They're recommendations for anyone who wants a cholesterol-free source of vitamin B12. This is not the only study to look at the arterial walls of those eating plant-based diets. This new study from China, for example, found that compared to omnivores, those that ate egg-free and meat-free diets, had all the typical benefits of eating more plant-based: lower body mass index, blood pressure, triglycerides, total cholesterol, bad cholesterol, fewer free radicals, maybe better kidney function, better blood sugar control, etc. But does all that translate to actual differences in their arteries? Yes, indeed, the omnivores had comparatively thickened arterial linings, all of which suggests about a tripling in their probability of developing cardiovascular disease. They therefore recommend that more vegetables should be eaten instead of meat, and it's never too late to improve one's diet. Having said that, if those on plant-based diets don't get enough vitamin B12, levels of an artery-damaging compound called homocysteine can start to rise in the bloodstream and may counteract some of the benefits of eating healthy. In this study from Taiwan, the arteries of vegetarians was just as stiff as those of the omnivores, and they had the same level of thickening in their carotid arteries, perhaps because of the elevated homocysteine levels in their blood. The negative findings of these studies should not be considered as evidence of neutral cardiovascular effects of vegetarianism, but do indicate an urgent need for modification of vegan diets through vitamin B12 fortification or supplements. Vitamin B12 deficiency is a very serious problem, leading ultimately to anemia, neuropsychiatric disorders, irreversible nerve damage, and these high levels of artery-damaging homocysteine in the blood. Prudent vegans should include sources of vitamin B12 in their diets. One study of vegetarians whose B12 levels were really hurting even had thicker, more dysfunctional arteries than the omnivores. How do we know B12 was to blame? Well, when they were given B12 supplements, they got better. Their arterial lining started to shrink back, and the proper functioning of their arteries returned. Without B12-fortified foods or B12 supplements, when omnivores are switched to a vegan diet, they develop vitamin B12 deficiency. Yes, it may take dropping down to around 150 picomoles per liter to develop classic signs of B12 deficiency, like the anemia and our spinal cord rotting from the inside out. But way before that, we may start getting increased risk of cognitive deficits and brain shrinkage and stroke and depression and nerve and bone damage, as well as having our homocysteine shoot through the roof. And that may attenuate the beneficial effects of a vegetarian diet on cardiovascular health. The beneficial effects of vegetarian diets on cholesterol and blood sugars need to be advocated, but at the same time, efforts to correct vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarian diets can never be overestimated.
Again, thanks to Dr. Greger, we need about 6 micrograms a day, whereas upper tolerable limit of B12 is just excreted through your urine, and too little can wreak physiological havoc. So what types of foods contain B12? Number 1 is tempeh, an Indonesian fermented and pressed soybean cake. Next we have nutritional yeast, great for sprinkling a cheesy flavor. Oats and breakfast cereals of all kinds. Mushrooms. Seaweed, including green, red, and brown algae. Spirulina, chlorella, and other microalgae. Alright, so just when we think of squash number 2, the vitamin dose, as a reason against a vegan diet counting off protein, calcium, iron, and B12, we have to worry about a phantom vital nutrient that we're missing in our diets. Fiber helps in digestive health, lowers cholesterol, improves your glucose and blood sugar levels. Let's find out why it's an essential nutrient from Dr. Greger.
When people think fiber, they think constipation. And it's true, if we could get Americans just to eat the minimum recommended daily intake of fiber-containing foods, we could save our country $80 billion, and that's just from the effects on constipation alone. Accumulating evidence indicates that greater dietary fiber intakes reduce risk for diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers, weight gain, obesity, diverticular disease, as well as constipation. So we need to eat more fiber-rich foods, which means eating more whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils. As fiber intake goes up, the risk of metabolic syndrome appears to go down. Less inflammation, and an apparent stepwise drop in obesity risk. And so, no surprise perhaps that greater dietary fiber intake is associated with a lower risk of heart disease, 9% lower risk for every additional 7 grams a day of total fiber consumed. That's just like some rice and beans or a few servings of fruits and vegetables. How does fiber do its magic? What are the mechanisms by which dietary fiber may extend our lifespan? Helps get rid of excess bile, feeds our good bacteria, changes our gut hormones, which collectively helps control our cholesterol and body weight, blood sugar, and blood pressure, which reduces the risk for cardiovascular disease. Reducing inflammation is a whole other mechanism by which fiber may help prevent chronic disease. The accompanying editorial to the Fiber and Heart Disease meta-analysis implored doctors to enthusiastically and skillfully recommend that patients consume more dietary fiber. That means a lot of whole plant foods. If, however, we do buy something packaged, the first word in the ingredients list should be whole, but then the rest of the ingredients could be junk. So a second strategy is to look at the ratio of grams of carbohydrates to grams of dietary fiber. We're looking for about 5 to 1 or less. So, for example, whole wheat Wonder Bread passes the first test, first word is whole, but then it's like corn syrup in a chemistry set. Let's see if it passes the 5 to 1 rule. What you do is divide the carbohydrates by the dietary fiber. 20 divided by 2.7 is about 7. That's more than 5, so it goes back on the shelf. Better than white, though, which clocks in at over 18. Now here's one that makes the cut. 15 divided by 3 equals 5. Can do the same thing with breakfast cereal. Multi-grain Cheerio sounds healthy, but has a ratio over 7, and then it just goes downhill from there. Here's an example of one that does make the cut, though sliding in under 4. The editorial concluded, the recommendation to consume diets with adequate amounts of dietary fiber may turn out to be the most important nutritional recommendation of all.
My husband just doesn't bring home the bacon anymore.
Now I bring home the sizzling.
Don't bring home the bacon, think lean. Bring home the sizzle.
Even if your culture is not vegan and meat is the center of your meals, you can always change your mind and veganize any cuisine around the world. The link between meat and developing illness needs to be made clear, as the prevalence of obesity is rising around the world, and diabetes as a result of poor eating in the millions, projected to increase by the World Health Organization soon. Just don't be this guy.
Get back, sidekick. I'll take care of this. I want
I'll get those keys right after this short little nap.
My diverse legs will do just the trick. Oh my God, here it comes. Yes, so much sooner.
Even if you don't develop diabetes, what about sexual dysfunction in relationship to what you eat and animal proteins? Let's find out.
What are some pill-free ways to improve your sex life? Exercise, quit smoking, don't drink too much, don't weigh too much, and eat a healthy diet. But what does that mean? Heart-healthy lifestyle changes are sex-healthy lifestyle changes, as has been demonstrated in studies from around the world, including in women. Sexual function in women is also significantly affected by coronary artery disease, atherosclerotic narrowing of blood flow through our arteries, including the arteries that supply our pelvis. So high cholesterol may mean lower arousal, orgasm, lubrication, and satisfaction, and the same with high blood pressure. So putting women on a more plant-based diet may help with sexual functioning. Researchers found that improvements in female sexual function index scores were related to an increased intake of fruit, vegetables, nuts and beans, and a shift from animal to plant sources of fat. And the same with men, a significant improvement in International Index of Erectile Function scores. In fact, the largest study on diet and erectile dysfunction found that each additional daily serving of fruits or vegetables may reduce the risk by 10%. But why? It may be due to the anti-inflammatory effects. 2 years on a healthier diet resulted in a significant reduction in systemic inflammation, as indicated by reduced levels of C-reactive protein. Fiber itself may play an anti-inflammatory role. Those who eat the most fiber tend to have significantly lower levels of inflammation in their bodies. The opposite was found for saturated fat, associated with an increased likelihood of elevated C-reactive protein levels. This is how we're used to seeing changes in inflammatory markers over weeks, months, or years. But people don't realize that the level of inflammation in our bodies can change after a single meal. For example, there's a pro-inflammatory signaling molecule in our bodies called interleukin-18, thought to play a role in destabilizing atherosclerotic plaques. As such, the level of interleukin-18 in the blood is a strong predictor of cardiovascular death. What would happen if you fed people one of 3 different types of meals? Sausage and egg butter oil sandwiches, or cheeseless pizza with a white flour crust, or the same cheeseless pizza, but with a whole wheat crust. Within hours of eating the sausage sandwich, interleukin-18 levels shot up about 20%, an effect not seen eating the plant-based pizza. And those eating the whole food plant-based pizza had about a 20% drop in IL-18 levels within hours, reinforcing dietary recommendation to eat a diet high in fiber and starches and low in saturated fat to prevent chronic diseases.
If your culture still makes a meat tree, or thinks that Spam is a food group, then it's time to take action and think about what your food is really made of. Here we see some billboards in North America supporting the vegan movement. Wanted to find out how much are we eating, and this chart shows multi-country analysis, and the meat trends are rising. We have this insatiable appetite for flesh, and we are increasing how much meat we produce and eat around the world. This is coupled with our increasing obesity epidemic and illness epidemics such as cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke risk, and diabetes. When we adopt a whole food plant-based vegan diet, we can help moderate some of these illnesses that our modern world is crippled with. As you see here, this is hip fracture incidence and vegetable protein intake, which has a negative linear relationship. The more vegetable proteins you eat, the less likely you are to have your hip fractured. Let's return back to our number 3 reason, that my culture is too animal-laden. I couldn't simply adopt a plant-based diet. Let's see what Dr. Campbell and his researchers have to say.
It is so counterintuitive. Eat meat, eggs, cheese, lose weight. NBC Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell tonight with a new study.
Here's the most important thing to remember. The studies on these foods
takes on one of the biggest diet debates. Is it more important to cut carbs or fat if you want to lose weight and stay healthy? Here with what the researchers found.
Is one healthier than the other? Is one healthier than the other?
I think low carb, metabolically and nutritionally, is healthy.
Good News America. Beef, eggs, butter, and tropical oils all back on the menu with a thumbs up from many experts.
The government altering guidelines for cholesterol consumption. More and more health experts are taking a fresh look at saturated fat foods that have been on the don't eat list for decades.
There's really no evidence to show that the low-fat diet has any advantage, and now there's really compelling evidence to the contrary.
This latest study was run by the Harvard School of Public Health. The study compared 3 diets: a low-fat diet, a Mediterranean diet, an Atkins-type diet, where people did not worry about calories but replaced carbohydrates, mostly with protein and fat from fish, chicken, and vegetable sources. Some experts worried about their health risks, especially cholesterol and other risk factors for heart disease. The Atkins-type diet was the winner, with people losing an average of just over 12 pounds.
These findings, though, are still going to be considered, I would guess, controversial because this was funded in part by the Atkins Foundation.
Packaging was always very seductive.
All in the media, and magazines.
Media is about being thinner, being skinny, looking this way, and if you eat this way, you will have the body you want, you will have all the energy you want.
Start losing weight today.
I have tried probably every diet that exists.
The work that you learned about in China is so important, so revolutionary in that regard.
Well, my work actually started many years ago in the laboratory. And one of the first things that we did that I found very exciting, we could turn on and turn off the development of cancer, the progression of cancer. I'm here to talk about health.
When people have a bad diet, that's when they need the Viagra, right, Doc?
Absolutely. My dad and Dr. Esselstyn, his colleague, were invited to speak to the legislature from the floor of the Kentucky House. And Kentucky has some of the worst health statistics in the nation.
The topic that I really want to share with you, it really has to do with the way we think about nutrition.
We obviously were flattered that he would give us some time, and we were gracious enough to be listening to what he had to say. I mean, you could hear a pin drop in that chamber, I thought, which was unusual for the chamber. All the members were so attentive. They wanted to learn. They wanted to hear.
What is so exciting is the fact that all you have to do to make yourself heart attack proof is change your biochemistry internally.
I found this staggering.
My dad's and Dr. Esselstyn's talks that day were historic. Never before had the idea of plant-based nutrition been presented from the floor of a state legislature.
So there you have it. Thank you very much for your time.
My dad got a very enthusiastic response, and he was so excited he called me up the next day, and that's when I got involved. At the time, I'd been working on an idea for a nutritional intervention program in North Carolina, and I sensed an opportunity to do the same thing in Kentucky to demonstrate the health benefits of a plant-based diet to the Kentucky legislature. I was highly motivated to do this because I knew my dad's research well, including a study that he had done in China, the most comprehensive study ever done of the relationship between diet and disease.
And so the China study was really an opportunity in a human setting to see if what we were learning in the laboratory had any bearing for a human population. Well, at the time that we were organizing the China study, we knew that for about a dozen different cancers, they were very common in some counties in China and much less common in other counties. Just that observation was interesting. I also was aware at that time that we couldn't really look at single nutrients and what role they might play. I was thinking of nutrients collectively working as in food. So the object of the China study was for me to measure as many things we possibly could.
My dad's research team collected blood, urine, and questionnaire data from 6,000 patients in 60 counties across China and measured a total of 367 variables. Then they let the computers go to work, searching for patterns among nearly 100,000 correlations that might indicate the relationship of food to disease outcomes.
As I looked at that body of correlations, I could see patterns emerging, somewhat like a hologram. You stare at this complexity and suddenly you start to see something emerge. And when I saw all of these variables in the food together with stuff in the blood, comparing it with all the disease outcomes, we tended to get the same answer. That the closer we would get to a whole food plant-based diet, the healthier we would be and the less disease we would incur. And that in turn was consistent with what I previously had been doing in the laboratory and what in fact also existed in literature from other places.
My interest in the opportunity with the Kentucky legislature also stemmed from my knowledge of the history of this idea. For many years, researchers have suspected that animal protein is not optimal for human health. This information has sometimes bubbled to the surface only to get buried in a sea of misinformation because of the influence of industry and government. A perfect example of this was in the late 1970s with a Senate committee chaired by Senator George McGovern.
So the Govern Committee held a series of hearings and published a report, Dietary Goals for Americans. The Dietary Goals for Americans realized that many of the problems, the chronic diseases, were related to the increases in saturated fat and cholesterol and sugar, refined carbohydrate consumption. And so there was this shift towards we need to move towards some of the foods eaten by societies that weren't plagued by these chronic degenerative conditions. So if you look at the populations around the world that are not dying of our 10 leading killers, it is rural Africa and rural China. And they have kind of, in one sense, remarkably different diets, at the same time actually remarkably similar diets. Without those studies that showed people this remarkable variability of disease rates around the world was not genetics, right? It's not just that people have different genes, but when you transplant people, they acquire the disease rates of where they're going, and generation after generation it gets worse and worse as they lose some of their traditional plant-based eating and start kind of accumulating this kind of Western lifestyle. And I think it was in that environment that the McGovern Committee said Americans need to shift their diets towards a more plant-based diet. The report first came out January 1977, but was kind of beaten back by some of the politics as such that there was kind of a much watered-down report by the end of that year.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
The greatest pushback came from the meat and egg industries, but the sugar industry called McGovern a puritanical do-gooder. The Salt Institute came out very strongly. The dairy industry wanted the goals scrapped. So not only did the agricultural lobby win in terms of changing the wording of the report, but they had the entire Nutrition Committee disbanded. And so, I mean, it really changed even how nutrition policy was going to go forward in the federal government. Hey, I mean, you look at, and these political reverberations continue to this day.
I saw good people making really stupid decisions. They didn't want to get crosswise of the mainstream. The mainstream being greatly influenced by the corporate sector.
Dairy products, nature's most nearly perfect food. And remember this, Tom, where the demand for other may fluctuate over the years, not milk and its products. Because folks need milk every day as much as, well, almost as much as the oxygen in the air.
I just saw these outside forces coming in and shaping our knowledge. Not only shaping our knowledge in very narrowly focused ways, but also working hard to keep this from the public.
This is what is laying to waste. I mean, the most likely reason our loved ones will die is heart disease, which is completely preventable, treatable, often reversible. I mean, and so, I mean, people should be angry that they don't know.
We can see how any culture that is not adopting a whole food plant-based diet will suffer from these various health problems. This is atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. So it's not really your culture that is not eating healthy, but more of the types of food, how much, how frequent, the variety that promotes or degrades our health. That closes the argument number 3, that my culture isn't vegan, and we move on to argument number 4 against a vegan diet, that meat is tasty. So how do we find plant proteins that taste like our animal proteins without the risk to our health? There's an increase worldwide in overweight people in the last 50 years and is set to increase. A plant-based diet can be the solution to this issue, but understanding the millions of molecules that make up a meal to give you a sensory experience, we can translate this into tasty food. But what if you love big extras, adore Big Macs, and gotta have those double quarter pounders? Well, I'm gonna tell you that this is 100% plant-based. Meet Impossible Foods burger that tastes like a traditional hamburger, sizzles and bleeds out with plant materials, zero cholesterol. Are you not convinced? Let's check it out. Always plant-based options, but we seem to forget this as we eat a lot of meat around the world. We think it's so tasty, however, moderation is not our strong suit. We love to consume heaps, especially when we're celebrating.
Best tailgate, brisket.
No, real football y pollo asado.
Hoops and wings. Dude, subs.
Hot dog.
Chili dog. No, Dodger dog.
It's gotta be crawfish.
Now you're talking. Burgers.
7-layer dip. Ribs. No contest.
Hummus.
What?
You need a hot grill.
Even though we may love meat, meat does not love us. Here is a multi-country analysis of dietary animal proteins per day and fracture risk, where there is a positive linear relationship. But how much meat can we eat safely? Let's check out what Dr. McGreger has to say.
What if we don't want just low risk for a heart attack, but no risk? One great stumbling block has been that government and national health organizations appear to have taken the patronizing view that the public can't handle the truth and would rather the science be watered down. But as Dr. Esselstyn wrote in the Cleveland Clinic Journal of Medicine, in cholesterol lowering, moderation kills. Even if all Americans kept their total cholesterol below 200, millions would develop coronary artery disease. Strong evidence showed we need to keep our total cholesterol under 150 to stem America's epidemic of coronary artery disease, our #1 killer. What kind of evidence? Well, in many cultures, coronary artery disease is practically unheard of when the total serum cholesterol levels are under 150. And here in the U.S., in the famous Framingham Heart Study, few of those with levels under 150 developed heart disease, and none died of it. Here's data from the 26-year follow-up of the Framingham Heart Study, the cholesterol levels of people that get heart attacks, and the cholesterol levels of those that don't. Because we now know that 35% of heart attacks occur in people with total cholesterol levels between 150 and 200, a target level of only 200 guarantees that millions of U.S. citizens will perish of coronary disease. We cannot continue to have public and private organizations on the forefront of health leadership recommend to the public a dietary plan that guarantees that millions will perish from the very disease the guidelines were supposed to prevent. With its lack of fiber and antioxidants, its emphasis on animal protein, fat, and extreme free radical production, the U.S. diet is largely responsible for our bitter harvest of chronic diseases. If the coronary artery disease epidemic is seen as a raging fire, and cholesterol and fats are the fuels, the American Heart Association has merely recommended cutting the flow of fuel. The only tenable solution is to cut the fuel supply altogether, by reducing cholesterol levels to those proven to prevent coronary disease.
Even though meat may be tasty, it is contributing to cancer, heart disease, obesity, and other illnesses, such as premature aging. So where do we get this substitute that can fool our taste buds into eating just like we used to, but with plant-based meats instead? Meat Beyond Meat.
If you think about meat and say, okay, well, it has to come from chickens, cows, and pigs, there's only so much efficiency you can wring out of that system. So we need to think about it differently. I'm Ethan Brown. I'm the founder and CEO of Beyond Meat, and our mission is to create meat directly from plants.
For decades, people have attempted to make imitation meat out of plants, but the appeal of those products has been limited because, well, the imitation has never been that convincing.
What is meat? I think about it from the perspective of what's in meat. And that's, lipids, it's amino acids, it's carbohydrates, it's minerals, and it's water, none of which have exclusive residence in the animal. They're abundant in the plant kingdom. So what we're doing is extracting them from plants, and then we're going ahead and assembling them in the architecture of animal protein or muscle. And by doing that, we're providing meat directly from plants.
So what makes Beyond Meat different than its predecessors is that instead of trying to take a product like tofu and pass it off as chicken, it's figuring out what makes chicken chicken and then rebuilds it from the molecular level. You might think that the key to creating a convincing imitation of meat is getting the taste just right. And flavor is important, but it turns out it's not the most important thing.
When I think about the single most important innovation that we were able to create, it really gets back to the texture. I think it really dates back to kind of our familiarity with animal protein, with that feeling on the teeth.
They're able to create this unique texture through a combination of heating, cooling, and pressurizing the proteins naturally found in plants.
I'm going to try some of this chicken.
All right.
The texture is really the key here. I mean, you get that feeling of, you use that word fibrous.
Right.
Stringy in a good way.
Right. Without the structure, without the fiber, I think you're not going to get that mainstream penetration.
Ethan's company is currently selling two kinds of plant-based meats, chicken strips and ground beef. Both are designed to mix with other ingredients in salads and sauces, which makes their job as passing as animal-based meat easier. 2015 will be a make-or-break year for Beyond Meat. The company is preparing its next product, one that aims right at the heart of meat eaters: a burger. That's a way taller order than some ersatz chili, but Brown and his team think they have an edge. See, once you start rebuilding meat from the ground up, you can do more than just make a facsimile of it. You can actually make it better.
So what you're having right now has more protein than beef. It has more iron than steak, more omegas than salmon, more calcium than milk, more antioxidants than blueberries.
Super meat.
It is a super meat.
And if they are able to create these true superfoods, the question becomes, are we eventually going to see a meatless future?
I don't think it's necessarily realistic to think that people are going to stop consuming meat. I think a niche population is going to do that. If you look at human health, and you look at heart disease, diabetes, cancer, these national epidemics we have, they are correlated with meat consumption. If you look at climate change, where greenhouse gas emissions are due to livestock, I can make an impact in each of those areas simply by changing out the amino acids at the center of the dinner plate. That's really exciting.
For decades, meat alternatives have been stuck in the health food ghetto. Beyond Meat hopes to break out of that, not by converting all of us to veganism and not by magically recreating an entire steak, but by nudging us to plant-based alternatives that are indistinguishable from the real thing. If they're right, if you can't tell the difference between, say, chicken and Beyond Meat chicken, and their product is better for you and the environment, the company is betting its future on the hope that you are about to become much more of a vegetarian than you planned.
All of these plant-based beef, spicy chicken tips, we got chicken wings and drumsticks, chicken breast and duck breast products, fish fillet. We've got tempeh that packs a huge protein punch. We've got tofu in all varieties of styles, pressed, fermented, beans of all sorts. This is red kidney beans here. We've got broad beans or lima beans, which are great for inclusion. Nuts and seeds. Walnuts are great. We've got wheat gluten that we can make into seitan products. So scientifically, plant-based meats are tastier and healthier than animal meats. Squashing number 4, that meat is tasty. We have the last reason against a vegan diet, that meat is the center of my meals. And this may be true if you listeners have not figured out how to stop including animal products in your life. But wait, isn't meat for athletes? For having a good physique and toned muscle mass? Good for babies and good for pregnant women? Here we have a table of maternal body mass index versus the time of death of your babies. The more obese you are, the shorter life expectancy. But why?
A randomized controlled trial of nutritional supplementation in pregnancy in a poor black urban population. The study was begun at a time when protein was just assumed to be deficient in the diets of the poor. Had they actually analyzed their diets before they started, they would have realized that wasn't true, but why let facts get in the way of assumptions? So they split poor black pregnant women into 3 groups and gave them an extra 40 grams of animal protein a day, and basically a couple cans of Ensure, versus about 6 extra grams of animal protein, or no extra protein, and sat back and watched what happened. The high-protein group suffered an excess of very early premature births and associated infant deaths, as well as significant growth retardation in the babies that survived. More protein meant more prematurity, more deaths, and more growth retardation. And when kids grow up, animal protein intake during pregnancy has been associated with children becoming overweight later in life and getting high blood pressure. The offspring of mothers who reported eating more meat and fish had higher blood pressure in adulthood. This was part of another failed dietary intervention trial, in which mothers were advised to eat a pound of meat a day. The increased weight gain and high blood pressure may be due to the obesity-causing chemical pollutants in the meat supply, as I've talked about before, or the animal protein induced rise in the growth hormone IGF-1, or it could be due to a steroid stress hormone called cortisol. A single meal high in animal protein can nearly double the level of stress hormone in the blood within a half hour of consumption, much more than a meal closer to the recommended level of protein. Give someone a meal of crab meat, tuna fish, cottage cheese, and the stress hormone levels shoot up. But instead give someone some barley soup and a vegetable stir-fry and rice, and the stress hormone level goes down after the meal. Right? And imagine if you did the meat, fish, dairy, meal after meal, day after day. You could chronically stimulate your stress response axis and increase the release of vasoactive hormones that can increase your blood pressure. And all that extra cortisol release has been linked to increased risk for elevated blood levels of insulin, triglycerides, and cholesterol. If you take men on a high-protein diet, meat, fish, poultry, egg whites, and switch them to a high-carb diet of bread, vegetables, fruit, and sugary junk, their cortisol levels drop about a quarter within 10 days. At the same time, their testosterone levels shoot up by about the same amount. High-protein diets suppress testosterone. That's why if you take men eating plant-based diets and have them start eating meat every day, their testosterone levels go down, and actually some estrogens go up. That's why bodybuilders can get such low testosterone levels. It's not the steroids they're taking. If you look at natural bodybuilders who don't use steroids, 75% drop in testosterone levels in the months leading up to a competition. Right? Testosterone levels cut by more than half. Enough to drop a guy into an abnormally low range. It's ironic that they're eating protein to look manly on the outside, but it makes them less and less manly on the inside. And from an obesity standpoint in general, a drop in testosterone levels may increase the risk of gaining weight, gaining body fat. What does cortisol have to do with weight? Well, there's actually a disease caused by having too much cortisol called Cushing syndrome. And this is kind of a before and after in terms of abdominal obesity, which is most of that white. Even in normal women, though, chronic stress, chronic high cortisol levels can contribute to obesity. And if they're pregnant, high meat, low-carb diets may increase cortisol levels in the mom, which can lead to inappropriate fetal exposure to cortisol, which in turn can affect the developing fetus, resetting their whole stress response thermostat, leading to higher cortisol levels their whole life, which can have serious health consequences. It can stick with them their whole lives. And indeed, that's what they found. Every maternal daily portion of meat and fish was associated with 5% higher cortisol levels in their children, as much as 30 years later, though green vegetable consumption was found to be protective. Higher meat and fish consumption, like 3 servings a day compared to 1 or 2, was associated with significantly higher cortisol levels, but eating greens every day appeared to blunt some of that excess stress response. And the adult children of mothers who ate a lot of meat during pregnancy don't just walk around with higher stress hormone levels, but also appear to react more negatively to whatever life throws at them. If you put them through that Trier test, which involves public speaking in front of a panel of judges, followed by a live math exercise, here's the stress hormone responses in those moms who ate less than 2 servings of meat a day, versus about 2 a day, versus about 2 to 3 servings a day. Note before the test started, the 2 lower mother meat groups started out about the same, just walking around, but their exaggerated cortisol responses was laid bare when exposed to a stressful situation. Now, the real-world effects of this is that after that sort of test, if you give people their own private snack buffet with fruits and veggies versus fatty, sugary comfort foods like chocolate cake, guess who eats less fruits and veggies? Those who have these high chronic stress levels. Cortisol has been implicated as a factor in motivating food intake, even when you're not really hungry. So no surprise that animal protein intake during pregnancy may lead to larger weight gain for her children later in life, and maybe even her grandchildren. That's how much the stress axis can get mucked around. Recent evidence suggests that the long-term adverse consequences may not be limited to one generation. The diet of a pregnant mother may affect the development and disease risk of her children and even her grandchildren. Ultimately, these findings may shed light on our rapidly expanding epidemics of diabetes, obesity, and heart disease.
So number 5, meat is the center of my meals, and a discussion with your family and your family eating habits can be causing generational health issues. If you believe that this juicy T-bone provides your nutritional value for your day, and it will promote you to a higher athleticism, then let's take a look at the value of staple foods around the world, where you have the bottom value is plants, and the top value is animals. Diabetes risk by diet style. Vegans and vegetarians strike at the bottom there, whereas more meat you eat, the higher chance of diabetes you will have. Vegan power, some example of bodybuilders that are all plant-based here for you. These athletes around the world are breaking stereotypes that you can be strong and plant-based. But aren't all plant amino acids essentially incomplete and need to be combined? Let's listen to Dr. McGreger's scientific explanation of the protein combining myth.
All nutrients come from the sun or the soil. Vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin, is created when skin is exposed to sunlight. Everything else comes from the ground. Minerals originate from the earth, and vitamins from the plants and microorganisms that grow from it. The calcium in a cow's milk and her 200-pound skeleton came from all the plants she ate, which drew it up from the soil. We can cut out the middle moo, though, and get calcium from the plants directly. Where do you get your protein? Protein contains essential amino acids, meaning our bodies can't make them, and so are essential to get from our diet. But other animals don't make them either. All essential amino acids originate from plants and microbes, and all plant proteins have all essential amino acids. The only truly incomplete protein in the food supply is gelatin, which is missing the amino acid tryptophan. So the only protein source that you couldn't live on is Jell-O. As I covered previously, those eating plant-based diets average about twice the average requirement for protein. Those who don't know where to get protein on a plant-based diet don't know beans. Get it? That's protein quantity, though. What about protein quality? The concept that plant protein was inferior to animal protein arose from studies performed on rodents more than a century ago. Scientists found that infant rats don't grow as well on plants, but infant rats don't grow as well on human breast milk either. So does that mean we shouldn't breastfeed our babies? Ridiculous. They're rats. Rat milk has 10 times more protein than human milk, because rats grow about 10 times faster than human infants. It's true that some plant proteins are relatively low in certain essential amino acids, so about 40 years ago, the myth of protein combining came into vogue. Literally, the February 75 issue of Vogue magazine. The concept was that we needed to eat complementary proteins together, for example, rice and beans, to make up for their relative shortfalls. This fallacy was refuted decades ago. The myth that plant proteins are incomplete, that plant proteins aren't as good, that one has to combine proteins at meals, these have all been dismissed by the nutrition community as myths decades ago. But many in medicine evidently didn't get the memo. Dr. John McDougall called out the American Heart Association for a 2001 publication that questioned the completeness of plant proteins. Thankfully, though, they changed and acknowledge now that plant proteins can provide all the essential amino acids, no need to combine complementary proteins. It turns out our body is not stupid. It maintains pools of free amino acids that can be used to do all the complementing for us, not to mention the massive protein recycling program our body has. Some 90 grams of protein is dumped into the digestive tract every day from our own body to get broken back down and reassembled, so our body can mix and match amino acids to whatever proportions we need, whatever we eat, making it practically impossible to even design a diet of whole plant foods that's sufficient in calories but deficient in protein. Thus, plant-based consumers do not need to be at all concerned about amino acid imbalances from the plant proteins that make up our usual diets.
As Dr. McGreger has shown us, we require more whole foods with some high in plant proteins for optimal health. Here is his daily dozen, available inside of his book, How Not to Die, and on his YouTube and website, nutritionfacts.org. So we're squashing argument number 5, that meat can be the center of your plate. Just make it plants, and it can taste as tasty as your Nona's sauce. Here are the top 5 reasons for a vegan diet. Number 1, it's biological. Number 2, the vitamin dose. Number 3, it's a part of my culture. Number 4, plants are tastier than animals. And number 5, plants are the center of my plate. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, share it on your social media, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check out my website at The Vegan Food Scientist.